All right, guys, let's start talking some about the book of Genesis. And I think that certainly over the next this week and next week we'll be able to cover this entire handout on Genesis. In this course, I've chosen to focus primarily on the first 11 chapters of Genesis because there's a lot more intersection with critical questions there. There may be some things that we want to stop and talk about and expand on a little bit more. It's not to say that it's unimportant, Genesis 12 through 50, but I think the structure of that part of the book is more clear. It's less fraught with technical questions and critical questions. So I want to, since we have a finite number of weeks, if it was up to me, seminary would go year-round and it'd be 3-hour classes, but that's not up to me. So we have a finite amount of time and number of weeks, and I want to focus that in the first 11 chapters of Genesis if we can. I want to give one kind of prefatory piece of just explanation here, or something that I want us to be on the same page about. A lot of this feels cursory. It even feels cursory to me. When you're trying to cover this much material, you're sort of at a loss to how much depth can we go and how much detailed study of this can we do and how much reading can you assign and how much work can you assign for somebody to do. And what I hope you'll view these lectures as, and these handouts as well as the reading that you're doing and the assignments that you're doing, is sort of a structural framework to help you go deeper elsewhere at other times. So as you're getting ready to preach through one of these books or study through it for family devotion, working in a particular passage for a research paper, whatever you might be doing, I hope that this material is building a framework for you that you can use as a jumping off point to then go deeper into specific issues. In other words, this is me saying we're not going to answer every question about Genesis. As unbelievable as that might be, we're just simply not going to be able to answer every question about every text in the Pentateuch in 15 weeks. In your handout, the first section of this deals with the structure of the primeval history within Genesis, which is actually a very straightforward structure. It's one that you would come to, I think, naturally reading through the book, but it's built around a particular literary feature, and that is the tolodoth, or the generational structure that is found in the book of Genesis. I think it's helpful when you're studying the first 11 chapters of Genesis to think, first of all, about that particular section of the book being a pre-Abrahamic history, being a history that's less definite in terms of its chronology and its progression, but certainly history nonetheless, and something that needs to be wrestled with and structured in a particular way. The author of Genesis, Moses, as we concluded a couple weeks ago, has structured this book so that we even have an identifying feature here, and that is the tolodoth structure within Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 11. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 4, you have what seems like a innocuous statement where it says that these are the generations, and that's tolodoth with a feminine plural ending on it. So these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Now, there's some debate about this first instance of tolodoth in the Genesis record. It could, on the one hand, be looking backwards toward what has already been given to us in Genesis 1:1 through 2:3. In another perspective on this, it could look ahead to the following narrative, where it says that there was no bush of the field yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for Yahweh, God, had not yet caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground. There was a mist going up from the land, and was watering the whole face of the ground. And then Yahweh, God, formed the man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living creature. In one sense, this does introduce us to something new, and that is the creation of man and his placement for a particular purpose within the creation. And so that this tolodoth could be looking forward, and it could be anticipating basically the tolodoth of Abraham, if you would, and looking at his specific place in the creation narrative, his role in the world that God has created. But it could equally serve as a structural marker, bringing to conclusion what has happened in Genesis 1:1 through Genesis 2:3. And you just have to make a decision about how this tolodoth is functioning in Genesis 2:4. The guys that are in Hebrew class will tell you, once you know Hebrew, all of your questions about the Old Testament are answered. And so ask one of them, hey, there's tolodoth, how's it functioning here? Is it concluding a section or opening a new one? We see in Genesis 5:1, however, a specific reference to Adam, which to me means, or it should at least give us some persuasion in the direction that the first tolodoth is a concluding tolodoth to what had happened in the preceding narrative. So in Genesis 5, we begin a new section, if you will, where it tells us that this is the book of the tolodoth of Adam. In Genesis 6:9, we shift the focus to Noah. We're told that these are the generations of Noah. Genesis 10:1 serves as another structural marker where we're introduced to the tolodoth of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. In Genesis 11, verse 10, so part way through the chapter, we're introduced to the generations of Shem. And then in Genesis 11:27, we're introduced to the generations of Terah, who of course is Abraham's father. And it's on the basis of shifting our focus to the generations or the tolodoth of Terah that we now have a major shift in the book of Genesis that takes us away from a broad, sweeping history of creation that could cover, not the creation itself, but this time period in Genesis 1 through 11 that could cover hundreds or thousands of years. Now we're being shifted down to a very finite period of time, and that is Abraham in a particular place in time and the subsequent generations from Abraham, which are not left with many gaps in the genealogy and are much more particular and definite. Now, when you're looking at these first 11 chapters of Genesis, then you're using this tolodoth structure as sort of guidance to say, where does this particular narrative, whether it's about the Elohim or the Tower of Babel or the creation of the moon and stars, where does this fit into this larger section of what we're calling a primeval history? And it's a good practice, it's a good discipline to have, to be able to see both the forest and the trees simultaneously anywhere that you're working in the biblical narrative. I almost cannot think of a situation, whether it's teaching in a classroom, a Sunday school class, preaching, writing a research paper, that it's not a good idea to be able to say, this is what this this is the message of this particular discourse. And maybe that's a paragraph length, something like that. But here's how it's fitting into this larger section of maybe a chapter or so around it. And being able to look both forward and backward. Here's a mistake. By the way, I've made it, so I'm going to call this a we mistake. Here's a mistake that we all make periodically, and I've seen people make, is there's a tendency to think about what happens in the narrative leading up to the passage that we're going to preach on, but rarely do you hear somebody give context for what happens after the narrative. So we often, and all of us do this, we say, here's a little background or backstory or context leading up to what's going to happen in this passage. And that's incredibly helpful that we're not just plucking a passage out and assuming that people know what's going on around it. But that passage is not always the final passage in that narrative or in that larger piece of discourse. And so it's helpful to be able to say contextually, by the way, here's the fulfillment of that later on. I've done this kind of in reverse before, preaching from a particular chapter in the book of Ruth, visiting a church, not having the opportunity to preach on the entire book of Ruth at the one time, preaching from chapter 2, but finding toward the end of my sermon, it was helpful to say, by the way, let me give you a little bit of context, which you don't normally hear at the end of a sermon, and saying, there's a larger conclusion to this story. The story doesn't totally end here. So this dialogue, this particular discourse ends, but it fits into something larger. When you look at the stories of Genesis 1 through 11, it's helpful to be able to situate them to a little bit larger unit of text within its tolodoth, and then be able to situate that within what's happening in the first part of the book of Genesis, and then extend from there into the whole of maybe the Genesis narrative, the Pentateuch narrative, the Old Testament, and finally how this fits into the canon. And imagine if every time you preached or every time you taught, you took the time to have just one sentence about how does this fit into the story that precedes it and follows it, and then one sentence about how does this fit into the tolodoth, and one sentence about how does it fit into the book of Genesis. And pretty soon, you've got a page to a page and a half, not that you're going to preach that, but you've got a page to a page and a half of contextualizing this story within the bigger narrative that is all about Jesus Christ. And this helps you avoid, man, I'm about to get on a little preaching soapbox. I'm not going to do that tonight because I don't have time. But this helps you avoid just sort of contriving in your mind how this fits into the larger narrative and how this text is about Christ. That's a question you can't even answer until you know how this fits into the larger, progressively larger pieces of text that it's situated in the canon itself. So I hope that this will be of some help to you, just simply as a structural marker the next time that you're working in Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 11, to be able to situate it within that particular story, that anthology, if you will, of the generations of the heaven and earth, or the generations of Adam, or Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and so on. Look with me at Genesis 1. I want to give you a couple of preparatory things, and then we're going to look at Genesis 1, and we're going to talk about creation and its intersection with ancient Near Eastern culture, critical issues, and things like that. Certainly, creation is a critical issue, for lack of a better term, within Genesis 1 and 2. I mean that critical in the sense that really twofold. It's critical for us to understand it. You can't really understand a book if you just gloss over the first few pages of the introduction. So you want to get your hands around that. It's also critical in that it's hotly debated. There are a lot of questions about it, and I can't imagine teaching a class on the Pentateuch without discussing it a little bit. Let me, first of all, turn your attention to ancient Near Eastern creation mythology. This is my attempt, by the way, to put this in a little bit of context. I know we're using that word a lot tonight, but to situate this in some context, because the world that the Israelites are living in is not out on an island. They're not divorced from the cultures and the people around them. When you drive down streets in any town, you find that there are some streets that are given an English name. Some of them are named by important people. I think every town in the United States of America has a Martin Luther King drive, or has a John F. Kennedy drive, right? No matter what town you're in. Something that's interesting, though, is you might be in a town in, say, the state of Arkansas. I can actually think of one in Russellville. And when you're in Russellville, you'll be driving down the road and there's a Cleveland Street. And you go, well, wait a minute, we're nowhere near Ohio. And then there's a Kentucky Boulevard. And so the city is situated in a larger context of people and places that Arkansas and the city of Russellville belongs to. But then you're coming down the street and you come to like a Saint-Jacques Street or a St. John Street. And you go, well, wait a minute, why are we slapping French names now on English street signs? It's because we're influenced by and we're a part of a broad culture. And the Israelites were part of a culture. They weren't living in a siloed, isolated place in the Near East. As a matter of fact, what we're thinking of here in Genesis 1, or Genesis 1 through 11, they're living in a culture that's not even theirs. And so the history of Israel, if you want to kind of start the clock at Abraham, is coming out of Mesopotamia. So there's a lot, and Abraham himself is really Sumerian, but what becomes Mesopotamian culture. So we're talking about a Sumerian man with Sumerian religion, whose father may have been influential in the practice of Sumerian religion, whose family comes out of that culture, whose language comes out of that culture, their eating habits, their hygiene habits, everything about them is influenced by their Sumerian upbringing. And then they begin to travel, he and his descendants, through the land of Canaan, and they're interacting with what are also Near Eastern cultures, but they're vastly different. How different is the culture in Saudi Arabia versus Israel? How different is it in Jordan versus in Lebanon or Iran? How different is pre-revolutionary Iran versus post-revolutionary Iran? So we shouldn't just think of these people as all being the same. They're all a very distinct people. And the early Israelites encountered the Sumerian cultures, but then moving westward across the Jordan River, they encountered the Canaanite cultures. And ultimately, they end up in the land of Egypt. And they not only encounter Egyptian culture, but they become ingrained within it. Joseph becomes a chief within Pharaoh's court. The Egyptians spend a vast amount of time living in Egypt. So there are generations of Israelites, we're calling them Israelites, there are generations of them being born, and guess what language they probably spoke? Probably Middle Egyptian, right? Now they may have known Hebrew or whatever Abraham was speaking coming out of Sumer, but these subsequent generations know how to read Egyptian. They become familiar with Egyptian culinary practices, Egyptian religion, Egyptian agriculture, Egyptian weather. If you were to ask them where you're from, if you meet, let's say in the days of Exodus 1, you meet a world-traveling descendant of Jacob, and you meet him in Spain, and you say, where are you from? What would he tell you? He would say, I'm from Egypt. He wasn't thinking of himself as a siloed person and say, well, technically I'm Israelite, but I live southwest of the land that God is going to give. He would say, I live in Egypt. So what kind of background, what kind of worldview would they have? They would have an Egyptian worldview. They would have Egyptian influence into their worldview. So it's important for us to at least get a sense of what was the world like in that part of the world during the time that the people we're reading about were living, and then later on during the time when Moses was actually composing in the 15th century, the Pentateuch. There are several features that when we talk about ancient Near Eastern creation, cosmologies and cosmogonies that explain or that seem to surface themselves regardless of what culture you're reading from. I need to put up, I'll see if I can go about creating this. I need to put for you guys in the files just a broad map of the ancient Near East, not assuming that you don't know that, but I understand not everybody sees that in their mind. But when you see a map of the ancient Near East and you have Egypt and you have Northern Africa, that is a sort of culture. And you have Canaan, and that's a culture. And you have Mesopotamia, and that's a culture. And you have the Arabian Peninsula, and that's its own culture. And you have the land of the Hurrians and the Hittites, and that's its own culture. And Syria. So there are vast different cultures here. But if you take any dozen of those and you read their stories or their rationalizations of creation, you see a few features that surface themselves regardless of if it's in Egypt or all the way across the Near East approaching the Asian continent. They almost always begin with a chaotic beginning. So chaos seems to be the thing that defines creation, whether you're talking to an Egyptian or a Sumerian or an Akkadian or Mesopotamian or Canaanite or a Hurrian or someone living at Ugarit. Where did the world begin? Well, they say, well, it began in utter chaos, right? That's what their religious instruction has always been. That's what their worldview has been. That it begins in chaos, so there's no structure, there's no order to it. The creation, however, exists. Its exact origin of beginning is unknown, but it is known that it existed in some kind of chaotic state that was uncontrollable and disorganized. This is what's referred to as a primal condition, a condition where there's no definite bodies of water segregated from land. There's no trees and flora and fauna that are growing on the land. You don't have animals and living beings inhabiting creation at this time. You don't even have distinctions in most of these Near Eastern cosmologies between different heavenly bodies, stars and planets and moons and things like that. You don't have any distinction about these things. They just kind of exist. And it's a very primitive, primal existence that is there in the midst of this chaos. And so you have some kind of material element that's present, something that's making up the chaotic, unfinished product that exists. So it's like being outside of the warehouse and all of the metal is there. All of the scrap is there to be melted down, but nothing's been done with it yet. It's just disorganized and there. Then you have creation, and you do have, most often, creation by speech. That is, this is not unique to the Hebrew Old Testament, that you have creation by speech. that the gods begin to organize and structure things not by physically moving them, but by speaking to them. This is an important point that I want to draw back on in a little bit, but I want us to plant that away in the back of our mind that creation by speech is not something that's unique to the Hebrew Old Testament. It's actually a feature within ancient Near Eastern cosmology. You have a naming of things. Y'all have probably read and you've come across various, most likely probably in commentaries, but maybe like a podcast. I'm trying to think. Somebody help me out. Who are the people that put out the real graphic Bible podcasts, the real catchy graphics and story? Nobody is going to help me with this? The Bible Project, right. You've probably heard Bible Project or reading a commentary, something like that. You're familiar with the importance of names in the Near East. Like, for instance, in the book of Exodus, why will Pharaoh not call Yahweh by his name, right? That's a place where it surfaces. Or what is the significance of having the divine name for Israel, where it appears that there was a time that maybe they didn't have the divine name revealed unto them yet. We're familiar with that, and that also is not a unique thing to the Hebrew Bible. The idea that naming things is significant and communicates control or providence over the thing which has been named, especially if you're not only calling it by name, but you're assigning the name to it. And so by giving it the name, you're asserting authority or providence over it. This happens in most of the epics of creation in the ancient Near East. They're also characterized by rest. Although the rest in Near Eastern cosmologies is different than the rest of the Hebrew story in Genesis 1 and 2, where rest for Yahweh is something to establish a pattern. It's something to establish a pattern for his creation. Later, it establishes a pattern for the Israelites, even in how they conduct agriculture within the land of Israel. Ultimately, and this is, I guess, an example of us broadening the canon here. Ultimately, this is going to establish a pattern for all of God's people, that all of them are to have rest. And what we find is that rest can't be found on a particular day of the week. It can't be found by taking a particular set of time to let your land recover and regenerate, but that we find the ultimate expression of rest in the person of Christ, who gives us a rest from which we never have to return to our labors, a rest that's full and complete and actually restores us to a condition that is greater than the condition we were in when we started and began our labors. Rest in ancient Near Eastern creation is typically a response to actually growing tired, to actually being physically exhausted, even as a deity, from what it took to subdue the chaos, to order all of the pre-existent material, to give it a name, to structure it. It sounds like being a god is a lot of hard work in the ancient Near Eastern cosmologies, where that's a point of divergence from the Hebrew narrative, where God seems to be able to just effortlessly create and order and name and structure and govern and hold together the consistency of everything that he's brought into the world. I want to read you this quote from John Walton. And there's a few of you guys, David Hacker sends me an email periodically about something that Walton says. There's your weekly shout out, David, since you're not physically in the building today. David's going to get annoyed because there's a lot of quotes of Walton throughout this handout, but it's a good source to interact with, not to wholesale swallow, but to interact with, because this is a prominent voice in evangelicalism, that both a critical scholar and a conservative preacher are liable to pick up his work and interact with it. He says, nowhere in the ancient Near East did people think of creation primarily in terms of making things. As can be seen from the analysis of individual elements above, creation in the ancient world constituted bringing order to the cosmos from an originally chaotic or non-functional condition. So Walton is looking, when he defines some of these elements of creation, he's looking at it and saying, hey, as a literary framework, what stories about creation generally do is they're not about how did the things come into being, but they're about how did they get ordered and structured into the way that we see them. Now, there's a little more that we're going to touch on about this later, but one way to think of it is when we read the creation story, we often think of the creation story in terms of how did the world come into being? And so we're walking around, and when we think about creation, we're saying, how did all of this come to exist? There was nothing, and then there was everything that exists, and it's here, and how did all of that happen? This is the question, by the way, that after the Enlightenment, scientific inquiry began chasing down, right? Is what was the origin of everything that now we can see? When did this begin? If the law of infinite regression we know is a metaphysical impossibility, there must have been some point of creation of the thing that exists. It had to go from non-matter to matter under some conditions in some way. And that's why the debate over creation is so heavily focused on this issue of, was everything created from nothing, or was it simply subdued? But to use some sanctified imagination, I think that in the ancient world, and this is a point where I do largely agree with Walton, I think that in the ancient world, the question being asked by the Canaanite walking down the street, walking through an olive grove, is not so much how did the atoms that became the olive grove come into existence, but like, why is this tree shaped the way that it's shaped? And why is it planted the way that it is? And why is its bark the way that it is? And why does it need a certain amount of rainfall? And why does this particular tree produce this particular kind of fruit, but this kind of tree does not produce that kind of fruit? How is it that this sea became arranged, but barring something catastrophic, the sea doesn't engulf the inland? It kind of stops where it stops. So there's some shape, there's order to creation. And all of ancient societies recognize that there are patterns, that they lived by patterns in their creation. They could depend on rainfall in a certain time of the year. And they could also predict, and I don't want to say plan on, but plan for drought at certain times of the year. And they had to learn that you plant barley at a certain time of year if you want to have a successful crop. And if you plant it too early, then the frost is going to kill the early emerging plant. And if you plant it too late, it won't come into full bloom in time for you to harvest a mature crop. And they saw patterns, and so their stories tend to answer that question, or ask the question rather, how did all of this get organized? How was all of this subdued to where we have distinctions between water and land, light and darkness, life and death? And that's the trajectory that ancient Near Eastern cosmologies head down. That doesn't necessitate, however, in my mind, that the Hebrew cosmology has to do the same thing. It doesn't mean that the Hebrew Old Testament has to be asking and answering the same questions that everything else was asking. And what we can do, just because some of this I'm going to have to give you guys just in summary fashion, and I can't really explain. And this hurts me, by the way, because I kind of know that Carter is sitting over here thinking, he didn't really defend that position. He just sort of threw it out there. But I'm going to have to do that with some of this. My position on this is that the Hebrew Old Testament in the creation narrative does tell us where matter itself originated. It is actually answering the question of where everything came from, because it's also answering the question, why does all of it exist? And the larger canon of Scripture is answering that question by saying all of this exists for God and for His glory, but He has chosen to share it with His people as well. And so after the creation is done away with, He's going to preserve them into the new heavens and the new earth and allow them to enjoy that as well under the lordship of the Lord Jesus, to fellowship with the triune God forever. The question being asked here, once you can read it in light of the whole canon, is partially, where did everything come from, but also, why does all of it exist? However, I think there are parts of the narrative that answer questions that the Israelite receiving this from Moses would also be asking. And that is, how did all of this get ordered and structured to function in the particular way that it does? Now, when it comes to significant creation accounts on page 2, there's obviously more than just these two accounts that are significant. But I think, in my estimation, as a weekend scholar, in my estimation, these are the two most important cosmologies that we draw on for the purpose of comparison, number one. But number two, and I'm going to put this in the form of a question. This is going to be hard. You guys are going to cheat a little bit because I've mentioned this before. But when you're in a history of religions class, or you hear I know about the distinction between religious and secular and all that, but when you're in a secular classroom, or a secular setting, or you're reading a book like Penguin's History of the World or something like that, and they talk about Israel's creation story, and they're trying to minimize it. They're trying to say, look, it was just influenced by other creation stories. It borrowed, plagiarized from those, refined them a little bit because it was later. What culture do they normally tie that to in your experience?
Mesopotamia.
Okay, thank you, Dalton. They usually tie it to Mesopotamia. So you hear things like Epic of Gilgamesh, right, to relate to the flood story. And we're going to read in just a minute a Mesopotamian Enuma Elish, a Babylonian creation narrative. But let me follow that up with a second question. You're living in, let's say, just prior to Moses' time, right? So you're living in the very early 15th century. Your granddaddy, Papa Ben Shalom, was born in Egypt. And he lived, to be 65 years old. He had your Daddy Ben Shalom, and he too lived in Egypt. And then you were born, somewhere around Memphis, for instance, and you grew up and you're being taught, of course, by the people around you. You're hearing stories from people around you. It's amazing the things that kids can learn, even if you don't personally teach them. It's amazing the cultural things that they will pick up on and learn. Most of it bad, to be frank with you. And if it's bad, you can also always tell people they didn't learn that at home. They learned that from the culture. And I hope that that's true. How much do you think the average Israelite in the 15th century knew about the Enuma Elish? I would say nothing, or virtually nothing. How much do you think they knew about the Epic of Gilgamesh? I mean, if we want to really drill down into this question, let me ask you all something. If you take American culture, we know that for all of the parsing and distinctions, that around the globe, America is seen as a Christian nation, right? We know the problems about that internally. But if you're from Spain or from somewhere in the Middle East or Asia and you think of America, you don't think first of Islam. You don't think first of secularization. You think of Christian. Probably Catholic is what comes to mind for most of these people. They think Christian, if they know any world history at all. I don't know what other countries teach about American world history, but it probably has something to do with pilgrims and the people, coming out. And so they're thinking Puritans, pilgrims, then later Catholics, but they're generally thinking Christian. So when you drive down the street, you expect to see churches, not mosques, not Sikh temples. Although I saw there's a Sikh temple now in Jackson, Mississippi, which blows me away. You'd never think. Even though there's a general preponderance of Christianity in our culture, I would venture to say there's not a single town without some form of church. There's not a single library anywhere without at least one copy of a Bible. How much does the average American know about the Christian story of creation? Very little. Even in an age of Wikipedia and books, and you can Google it, you can ask Siri, you can ask Alexa to tell you the story of creation. They can tell you about it. So even in Sumerian culture or Mesopotamian culture, if you picked out any 10 Mesopotamians off the street and asked them to tell you about the Epic of Gilgamesh, how many of them do you think could tell you? How many of them are literate? How many of them have ever been in a formal center of worship where Mesopotamian worship is being conducted? Very few. So if generously 3 out of 10 Mesopotamians could tell you anything about the Enuma Elish or the Epic of Gilgamesh, how many Canaanites next door, few, 100 miles to the west, in some cases a couple thousand miles to the west, how much could they tell you about it? And then if you keep going hundreds of miles more southwest into Egypt, how much is a Middle Egyptian, maybe Proto-Hebrew speaking Hebrew, going to know about some Mesopotamian creation epic? They're just not. And a lot of this is presupposed on my part. But I'm going to argue that the Epic of Gilgamesh was not circulating around in Egyptian circles where Moses and others were reading about it. But what was influencing them was Egyptian mythology, because that's where they're living. That's the culture they're ingrained in. This quote from John Wilson, you'll also read it in your book Against the Gods that you're doing a book review on, I put this in here only because it's interesting, not because it has any real utility for us. He says it's significant that a plural should be necessary, that is, talking about Egyptian mythologies rather than the Egyptian mythology. It's significant that a plural should be necessary, that we cannot settle it down to a single codified account of beginnings. The Egyptians accepted various myths and discarded none of them. In other words, if they saw or heard or encountered a new myth of creation, they weren't prone to weigh it against their own and say, no, that can't be right because this is they would just absorb it into their own religious culture. This is one of the things that makes studying Egyptian history and religion just frightfully difficult, just almost impossible, because there is no clearly defined set of religious instructions or mythologies or practices. They seem to really be so pluralistic that they'll just accept anything, even if it's contradictory to and conflicts with other parts of their religious system. That's no problem. Just accept it in, is very pluralistic, and that's the way they are in their Egyptian mythologies. But there's some common ground that we find in Egyptian mythology that we find to other ancient Near Eastern cultures. That the cosmos, first of all, originated in the primordial waters. These are given a name, Nun, in Middle Egyptian literature. So there's the idea of the cosmos is in this sort of soup, this primordial water referred to as Nun. There's a creator god in the Egyptian mythologies, and sometimes in places referred to as Atum, sometimes Amon-Re, and sometimes simply Re. And this is influenced, by the way, because there were times where the center of Egypt's political and theological thought was further in the south of the country, in Upper Egypt, or in the further northern parts of the country in Lower Egypt. And as this shifted, the names of deities and practices would shift as well because of Egyptian dialects, even though, generally speaking, they're referring to the same thing. So out of the watery chaos comes Atum, or Amon-Re, or Re, and comes out of the watery chaos. It has produced the god. So now we're seeing a big point of departure from the biblical narrative. And he comes out of the water, and then he begins to look around, maybe out of anger, and says, I'm going to subdue that which has been created. So the creator God establishes order from the chaos by subduing it and creating deities who are personified in the elements of nature. So in this subjugation of creation, what's happening is you're taking water, you're taking reproduction, you're taking the giving of crops from the land, you're taking thunderstorms, you're taking the wind, you're taking a piranha, whatever, and you're beginning to personify it as a deity. And so the great creator God is taking all of creation, reducing it down to particular deities, and then assigning them their function. This wind blows at a particular time, this crop grows at a particular time, this piranha swims where he swims. But this is answering the question then of why is it that the Nile floods so predictably? Why is it that even the Egyptians knew? Either because they patterned this or because aliens were transponding this to them. That's a joke, by the way. They knew that, hey, in 100, I know that their cycle of a year is different than our cycle of a year, but in 100 years, the moon's going to be in a particular place in the sky. The stars are going to align in a particular way. They could even develop something like a farmer's almanac. If you all have a farmer's almanac, those are fun to read. And it's scary sometimes how accurate it can be about things. And it tells you, what the general trajectory of weather and patterns is going to be. And you read that and you go, wow, it's interesting that we can predict that with some reliability. Well, the Egyptians could do the same thing. They knew in many cases when to expect tidal floods from the Mediterranean. They knew when to expect the Nile to come out of its banks in the springtime. They knew when there would be years of feast and years of famine, not perfectly, but in general. So what kind of question are they asking about creation? How did all of this begin to be ordered and structured the way that it is? And then how do you account for when the Nile floods, even though you didn't think that it should? Or you thought this year would be a bumper crop, and it's been a very poor crop. Or there's some, group of women who are infertile, you begin to rationalize this by saying these deities that control the flood, control fertility, control agriculture, they're acting, but they're doing so in a way that diverges from the creation that was originally established, and now we've got to do something to get back in their good graces and direct them back toward the proper ordering of things. There was a subsequent creation of light, a division of waters and dry ground, creation of vegetation, heavenly bodies, fish, birds, animal, man. So in many ways, this is a point of analogy with the creation narrative in Genesis, that after the deity is beginning to create and act, now he's giving order to everything that exists. Therefore, you can account for why things are the way that they are. That's why the olive tree gives a particular kind of fruit and the orange tree gives its own kind of fruit. I don't really know if there are orange trees in Egypt, just full disclosure. But let's just, for the purposes of this lecture, assume that there are. In Mesopotamian mythology, the most significant single piece of Mesopotamian literature that we have is the Enuma Elish, which is from roughly the 12th century. However, the Enuma Elish clearly is older than this in terms of the things that it's referencing. Now, we could look at the production of the Torah and say that's in the 15th century, but it's looking back to events that happened much earlier, and such would be the case for this Enuma Elish as well. The cosmos originated in primordial waters. These are also given names: Apsu, Mamu, Tiamat. Hold your thoughts if you've heard this before, that the creation mythology begins with utter chaos, the deities in the chaos being born out of it. Where it diverges from both the Hebrew Bible and from other ancient Near Eastern cosmologies, or some of them, is that this pantheon is being created rather than a single unifying deity that's responsible for creation. So Tiamat and Apsu are created, these sort of two governing deities, and they create this whole structure of subordinate gods, this pantheon underneath them. But this results in chaos because the lesser deities don't like being the bench players. And so now they revolt against the greater deity. They revolt against Apsu and Tiamat. And now there's chaos that's born, and it explains that condition prior to everything being established. Well, one of those lesser gods is Marduk. You've heard of Marduk, you've read things about Marduk in a biblical text. Well, Marduk slays Tiamat. So the lesser deity prevails, kills Tiamat, establishes order, and created the cosmos from the severed torso of Tiamat. So he killed the greater deity and then used its corpse to create everything that exists as an act of judgment against the deity, but also an act and demonstration of power and providence. Subsequently, there's the creation of light, firmament, dry ground, heavenly bodies, man. So again, it's accounting for all of the things that you look around and you can see. But it seems like this cosmology is as much concerned with establishing Marduk's place atop the Babylonian pantheon as it is answering the question of the origins of the cosmos. So here's what we have, just in a quick summary before we talk about important distinctives and then begin to look at the Hebrew narrative. There's a bunch of things, and these are all swirling around in my mind, right now. So I'm going to try to organize them and just throw them at you. The Hebrew Old Testament and the story of creation is being produced in a world that has cosmologies that are on one hand very distinctive, and on the other hand have a ton of overlap and analog. They all look to creation as having some kind of primordial water, a something of nothingness, if you will. They all have an explanation for how chaos ensued out of that. So creation didn't go from primordial to clean. It went from primordial to chaotic, then subsequently to being ordered and structured, either through Marduk killing Tiamat and creating it, or the Egyptian pantheon being created to order the particulars of the creation. In the Hebrew scriptures, which we'll talk about specifically in a minute, we see that there's primordial chaos, but then we see that there's structure that Yahweh is establishing and naming and things like that are taking place. And this creates an interesting mix in my mind of analogy with the Hebrew story of creation and divergence, where I don't feel like they're totally distinct and I don't feel like they're totally dependent. I think that there are things here that we see that are obvious points of contact, like the naming of things, the separating of land from water, the separating of light from day, the putting the stars and the sun either in the firmament or in the sky, however you want to look at that. But there are also unusual, like unanticipated points of contact. The revolution of the little pantheon against Tiamat and Apsu is not unlike what we read in the book of Job. Now, there's an unusual point of contact here, where the creation for us is a physical thing. For these other cultures, the creation are little deities personified, so that's a point of divergence. But the idea of the creation itself rebelling against its creator is not unique to the Hebrew scriptures or to the ancient Near Eastern scriptures. It's a point of contact that you don't expect, just like you don't expect to see this point of contact about revolution and the attempt to overthrow the creating deity. And I promise I have an explanation for some of this, or what I feel is an explanation, but I don't want to bore you for the rest of the lecture if I just lay all my cards on the table right now. There are some important distinctives in these creation mythologies. These are things that make them distinct from the Hebrew text, the Hebrew story in Genesis. There's theogony, which is the birth of the gods. So the gods themselves are not pre-existent. They're not separate from the creation. They are a product of it. And you could actually, to be more proper, you could speak of it three distinct things: the primordial cosmos, deity, and creation, because creation is the product of the deity subduing everything that existed beforehand. So I don't think those things in ancient Near Eastern thought are conflated. What existed before the gods did their work and what existed after the gods did their work were not the same thing. It was chaotic, unformed, perhaps matterless beforehand. Afterward, matter had been formed. It had been brought into subjection. To quote from Walton, he says, in the beginning of the process, the Creator God, by means of his own bodily emission, it might be sperm or saliva or mucus, is doing something to create, to bring into existence what we think of as like stone and oxygen molecules and hydrogen and everything that exists. Then procreation proceeded to fill in the first rank of deities that represented the principal elements of the universe. So this is a distinctive thing in ancient Near Eastern creation, that the God himself is giving birth to the subsequent pantheon, to the things that become later the creation itself. He goes on to say, this is one area of worldview where the biblical text stands firmly against the common ancient worldview. The Israelites had no other gods to bring into existence, and they did not identify deity with the primal elements or other natural phenomena. Now this extends, this permeates almost, really, I don't want to make such a broad statement, but I think it's basically true, permeates cultures everywhere throughout all of time. You find Native American artifacts, and unfortunately very little is written in Native American cultures, but there's a lot of artifacts. And guess what? We still have Native Americans among us. We have those stories being passed down. What do they identify deity with? Many of their cultures identify it with elements of creation. So deities personified in the ram and in the buffalo and in the eagle and in the pine tree and in the waters and in the wind and in the moon and the sun and so on. But you can turn the clock back thousands of years to Egypt and find that same tendency. You can find it in Asian cultures. You can find it in Northern European cultures very early on. There's this distinctive connection where they look around and say, this is the gods, right? And this is very different from the Hebrew worldview that sees God as distinct and apart from creation, not a part of it. There's theomachy. the battle or war or conflict between the gods. This is interesting, and by the way, there are English translations of all this, so you can go out and you can read these cosmologies, and you find this, that while the primal elements were generally brought into being through theogony, that is the birth of these things, it was often a battle between the gods that eventuated in the full organization and setting of the destinies for the cosmos. So what we have is a result of the God who prevailed, in other words. In the Babylonian mind, what they had was different from what they might have had if Tiamat and Apsu had prevailed. But they had what they had as a result of Marduk's prevailing. Human servitude is an important distinction. The roles assigned to humans bind them together in their common plight and bind them to the gods in servitude. Sumerian and Akkadian sources consistently portray people as having been created to do the work of the gods. But you ask yourself, why would the gods create little ants to run around on the creation and to do things for them? It's because they needed them for food. It's because they needed them for sustenance. And so man is answering the question of why do we exist? And his answer is we exist to maintain the existence of the gods. There's an interesting point of contact here. Why does man exist in the Hebrew Scriptures? He exists for God. He exists for His glory, to ascribe worship to Him, to honor Him. However, He doesn't exist as a slave in the sense that He must do this work in the Garden of Eden or Yahweh is going to die of starvation, right? Yahweh doesn't need man to filter the water for Him. He's self-existent, which creates a huge another set of questions. It's easy to answer the question, why do we exist? If you're Babylonian, you say, well, the gods have to continue to exist. They've created us to serve them. If we don't serve them, they're going to punish us severely, so we do the work that they require us to do. But the Hebrew worldview says, wait a minute, God doesn't need us to exist. There must be some other different explanation than for our existence on this earth than trying to sustain the cosmos that has been brought out. At the end of that quote, it says, work is essential for the continuing existence of the gods and work that they have tired of doing for themselves. They've already kind of depleted their energetic resources, and now they need something to step in and take over from there. The deities, and this is interesting, if you're going to highlight something on this kind of subsection here, I think this is an important thing to highlight because this is going to resurface later. I'm going to try to wrap as much of this up as I can. Probably I won't be able to get to it tonight, but I'll try next week. The deities reflect the characteristics of their human creators. If you were going to create a deity, what would that deity be like? For us, it's impossible. I would argue it's actually impossible for us to answer this question objectively because we know too much, because we've been given the scriptures, because we know what true deity looks like. We know about God and His characteristics. And we can't pretend that we don't know that God is omnipotent and that He's omniscient and that He's holy and that He's distinct from His creation, that He's gracious, but He's perfectly just. Our minds are too cluttered with those categories for us to legitimately divorce themselves. But what if you're creating a deity basically from nothing? If you're creating a deity without scripture to inform you of what that looks like? What if you have an oral tradition? Let's just suppose for a moment that all of mankind had known who the true God was and what He was like. Like, let's imagine, if we will, that our first parents could stand in a garden and they could talk with the living God. Let's imagine that the world is wiped out in a flood, but all who are remaining know the living God. They know these stories. They pass them down. So there's some story, there's some tradition, but there's no written scripture to work with. Now you've got to create a deity. Well, what do you create him like? You can only analogize him to one thing, and that is to yourself. And what are people like? They're prideful, they're lustful, they're greedy, they're petty, they get angry over little things. It turns out they got offended in the ancient world, just like people get offended in the modern world. They get offended, they keep a record of wrongs, they decide that they're going to take matters into their own hands, they're autonomous, they're brilliant, And so they say, well, we're going to make the gods like the highest version of ourselves. And they think if there's a God, that God must be greedy like I am. And he must be angry when things don't go his way, like I'm angry when things don't go my way. One of the most important distinctions in ancient Near Eastern, not just cosmology, but all of their literature and worldview, is that the gods are elevated humans rather than humans being a lower version of God himself. And so the gods have been recreated and reconstituted in the image of the people of these cultures. Now we're going to take a 5-minute break. I want to see if there's any quick questions that you might have about this piece of the material before we talk about some interpretation of Genesis in light of these things. All right, the diaspora is satisfied, and it looks like you here in Zion are satisfied as well. All right, 5 minutes, we'll come back, and I'll get started at 6:35. Yeah. Well, I know there's a lot more that could be said about taking these Near Eastern cosmologies and kind of dissecting them, and there's nothing that prevents you from going home and printing off an English translation of Enuma Elish and reading it, or finding a volume of, I know there's a text of the Ancient Near East volume out there that you can get, and it has a lot of these translated into English. You also have the option to go learn Middle Egyptian and then read them for yourself. Go to a museum somewhere, and if you just really want the firsthand experience. I think what we can establish, though, just from this first part of the conversation, is that there is a shape and there are patterns and there are themes, once again, in that worldview, in that culture in which the Israelites lived, out of which the Pentateuch was produced, and out of which the creation story was produced, and then would have been passed down. And it would have been passed down in a contra kind of way, because there are many points of conflict, even while there are points of analogy. A question for us is, how do we go about our work of interpreters in light of this and other and much more knowledge and material that exists from the ancient Near East? In Genesis 1:1, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." There is no history in the Hebrew worldview that predates this moment. Now notice that the first recorded moment of the existence of anything, of any time, any matter, not even primordial waters, but the first moment of existence of anything at all whatsoever is accounted for here in the beginning. If that moment, if the clock of history and existence begins in Genesis 1:1, what is God doing there? Because at the time of the beginning, from that base preposition, right, Matthew? At the time of the beginning, sorry to put you on the spot. By the way, so some of our other Hebrew guys, Matthew Watchurch is in the room with us right now. So he is our Hebrew authority. He's been sent on behalf of those guys as their delegate. So everything he says reflects on them as well.
Tried to help John because he actually read his video on. He was just floating down in his hand. So
yeah, at the time of the beginning, God is already there. Creation is not accounted for. His existence is not accounted for. There's no pantheon. There's no coming out of the creation. The creation itself, even the cosmos. Remember those three categories earlier: a cosmos and a deity and a creation. Neither the creation nor the cosmos are there yet, and yet there is God in the middle of the narrative. What this signals in the earliest parts of the Hebrew creation narrative is that the deity for Israel predates, as it were, that he pre-exists even time itself, even cosmos, and certainly creation. So in the beginning, God is there, above, distinct from his creation, and he is creating from nothing. He's not working with anything. In the beginning, the first verbal idea in the Hebrew scriptures is God creating. So bringing cosmos and bringing matter into existence is the first verbal idea in the written Hebrew scriptures. Now, I know there are some of you that are thinking that's not a technically true statement because the first written scriptures were probably the Ten Commandments, right? But if we set that aside and we say, okay, the first written full version, the first time Moses wrote the King James version of Genesis, the very first verbal idea that was included was the idea of creating. So the origins, not just of how did this olive tree get here? Why does the water end where it ends? Why can we predict with certainty that this bright light in the sky is going to be over here in 100 years? We're already answering that question because God created it. Each little piece of it, as well as the final product and the whole. In Genesis 1:2, it says, at that time, so in the beginning, when God was creating the heavens and earth, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. So it looks at creation and says there is a time where there is, on the one hand, matter, but that matter is yet unformed, it's unshaped. That matter itself is predating in the chronology of creation here in Genesis 1. It's predating the actual formation of things as we see matter now. So the heavens as being a heavens, the body in the sky being the body in the sky, the land being composed of what it's composed of. So it's a point of analogy where this is not unfamiliar that the creation was in a state of disorganization. And I'm not sure that chaos, by the way, is the right term here. Because when we think of chaos, we think of something just flying around, not apparently trying to do anything in particular. We think, Travis will appreciate this, we think of Auburn's defense as chaos. Just, there's no apparent plan. They're just sort of running around and it's there. And maybe that's what's being figured in the creation narrative is it's just, but in the Hebrew narrative, that's not what we're thinking of when we're thinking of chaos. We're just simply thinking matter without its final formulation, without its final structure. But notice that once again, in the middle of verse 2, we're introduced to a character in the middle of that chaos. The Spirit of God, the Ruach Elohim, was hovering above the face of that chaos. Now, in the motion picture of Egyptian creation, there's cosmos, out of it comes deity, then the deities organize themselves and then subdue that chaos. But in the motion picture of Genesis 1:1 and 2, before there's anything, there's God, and later in our later Trinitarian development, there's God the Father who's present, but also the Holy Spirit that are already present, pre-cosmos and pre-creation. And the Spirit of God is there, a surprising piece of information to the Israelite who is steeped in the story of Egyptian creation mythology. In the subsequent verses, in 1:3 through 2:3, so the rest of this section, this tolodoth, Yahweh speaks. So there's creation by verbal fiat. He's not creating by taking the blocks and stacking them on top of one another. He doesn't take the corpse of a slain deity in his hands and begin to form it. He doesn't take the back of his hand and push the waters out, but he simply speaks and says, "Let there be light." Now there was light. And let the light be separated from the darkness. And the light and darkness are separated. And he calls the light day, and the darkness he calls night. Let there be dry ground separated from the waters. Let there be heavenly bodies that occupy the space that is above the earth. Yahweh simply speaks in a sort of effortless and frankly anticlimactic way, if we can say that about something as monumental as creation, where you're living in and you're brought up in stories of the gods killing one another, spilling their blood, they're fighting, there's tension, and they're doing everything they can, and it's exhausting for the gods trying to chase down all of creation and pull it all together and organize it. In the Hebrew story of creation, God simply speaks. And where there wasn't light before, now there's light. Where there weren't heavenly bodies, now there are heavenly bodies. Where there was just chaos, now there's places where water begins and ends, and there are places where dry ground ends and begins. There are little fish swimming around in the waters now, and there are birds flying in the air, and there's the grass growing and the trees giving their own fruit, and eventually animals that are populating the earth, and eventually man being created to both subdue that, but also to enjoy it, to have everything created for him, for his enjoyment. The fruit of every plant is for you, right? And these points of contact begin to melt away a little bit because you say, okay, we can dig far enough here to find some themes that are similar, but the movies are totally different. The story of what's happening here in creation could not be more different and less chaotic and more organized and more, I don't want to use the word deified, but that's really what it is. It's more holy. It's under control. The God of the Hebrews is not having to chase his creation around and run himself to exhaustion. He's able to simply create what he desires to create, how he desires to create it. And at the end of every creative activity, it says what of it? That it was good. That it was organized and good and providentially under his control. In Genesis 2:4-25, the first tolodoth, so if you're looking at the tolodoth going forward, is introduced by giving attention to the creation, blessing, and purpose of mankind. So that tolodoth is being given to mankind, maybe in a broad sense, whereas it's going to focus more specifically on Adam in Genesis 5:1. Now, here's something that you've always heard. Maybe I should just turn the mic over to y'all for just a minute. I guess in my mind, the place I think of this happening the most is in an educational setting. So I think of it Travis, you were talking about going to a college where you were learning this. So you think of a history of religions class, or in theory, you go to a secular college and you're sitting in a biology class, or a history class for that matter. But I would think this also takes place in schools, like public schools and or private schools for that matter, if they're secular private schools. And you're told, the story of creation, yeah, it's interesting, but did you know that there are other stories just like it? Oh, yeah, the story of creation is not unique. As a matter of fact, there are stories that are older, that predate the Hebrew composition. And it seems pretty obvious that they just kind of plagiarized and grabbed what they wanted. And it's basically like reading the same story just from a different book. And what is the goal of that? Like, why would you point that out in a biology class or a history class or religions class? You're just trying to undermine the story, right? By the way, this is a flaw. I don't want to say fatal flaw because then I'm plagiarizing Jeff Johnson, but this is a flaw, is that the dependence for the critic always goes one way. It's never Enuma Elish plagiarized from the creation narrative, right? Or Epic of Gilgamesh plagiarized from the creation narrative. The Torah was existent by the 12th century, so therefore the Enuma Elish theoretically could be derived, although Epic of Gilgamesh is much older and Atrahasis is much older. When we talk about law codes, Hammurabi's law code, quote, Hammurabi's law code, does predate Pentateuchal law by quite a bit, but some of these stories are later. So why does the dependence always have to go in one direction? Why is it only the Hebrews who are capable of plagiarizing another story? But anyway, before I chase that rabbit trail too far, what you always hear in that is it's just basically a carbon copy. But if you look at the Enuma Elish, and by the way, I'm making a visual representation of what you've already been reading in Merrill and Rooker and Grisanti. The first 160 lines of the Enuma Elish have not a single point of contact with the book of Genesis. So you take 5 tablets, and you take the 150 lines, and you can't find a single point of contact between that and the book of Genesis. Not a similar theme, not a similar event in the story, not a similar character, nothing. There's just no relevance and no contact. But in the next 130 lines, where Marduk becomes, the chief deity, surely there's going to be some point of contact there. And yet that doesn't really give you a point of contact. This is the blessed man that you've read about in Hebrew wisdom literature. Thank you, Christian. There's no analogy between Marduk and the story of Genesis. In the next 138 lines, can you imagine how long it takes to sort through 138 lines of cuneiform Akkadian text? And some scholars done it. And in that, where Marduk asserts his supremacy, there's no point of contact with Genesis. Well, give it just 134 more lines. Which, what is that? What does that represent? Years of archaeological work and orthographical work and being able to sort all of this out? And we read about Tiamat being destroyed, of course, so Marduk can create from her torso. And there's no point of contact. Well, the next 5 lines, part of Tiamat's body is taken and maimed into a firmament, and part of it is made into waters. So it's clear that Genesis has just plagiarized the whole story, because now we have a point of contact, right? Because there's an idea of a firmament above and land below. Next 27 lines, there's no point of contact. You take tablet 6, which was found later on, and the first 44 lines of tablet 6, Marduk actually creates man from mud and from the blood of one of Tiamat's monsters, one of the deities under Tiamat's authority. And so if you really stretch your mind, you go, well, we could tie that into Adam being created from the dust of the ground, the way that Tiamat is creating, or Marduk is creating man from mud and blood from Tiamat's monsters. So it seems clear to me that all the Hebrews did was plagiarize the Enuma Elish, right? The next 86 lines, this heavenly sanctuary is constructed for Marduk. We're certainly told in Scripture about Yahweh's heavenly throne and sanctuary, but not in the book of Genesis, not in the cosmology. It's a later development, but it's not related to the idea of creation as it's given in Genesis 1 and 2. And then the next 214 lines. So if you ever wanted to learn Akkadian, here's your impetus for doing that. You can read 214 lines of names of Marduk. And the 15 names of Marduk are being proclaimed. You put this in perspective and you go, well, you're always being told it's not actually true. Or you're being told that these stories are just the same, they just borrow from one another. Okay, yeah, they have creation stories and the Hebrew Bible has creation narrative. That doesn't mean that they're the same thing. And it's inconsistent to assume that the dependence always goes in one direction. And that's just one example to give you some perspective. I should have given an assignment. I thought about this later on, and it's too late. The syllabus is like the law of the Medes and Persians, and it cannot be altered. But there's a thought that what we should have done is we should have all taken a cosmology and read the whole thing and read the whole Genesis account and find all the points of contact. And you're not allowed to cheat and make like these big sweeping thematic connections. You've got to actually look where you go, okay, it seems like this was plagiarized from this or borrowed from this or dependent on it and whatever. But then you've also got to prove that that dependence only went one way. You've got to prove that it couldn't have gone the other way as well. Let's talk for a minute about myth and history in the Genesis account. This first point here is something we could elaborate on a lot, but I'm just going to give it to you in very summary fashion. Very important in studying a cosmology or a cosmogony is to keep in perspective the key questions that they were designed to answer. And we've been hitting on this all along in this lecture. But when you're reading something, you can't be looking to it for answers to what it's not answering. Does that make sense? There has to be some analogy between those things. So if you're out there like trying to figure out how to swap the alternator in your car, and you've been reading this book all day, and finally your wife goes, why can you not get that alternator fixed? And you say, I don't know why, I've been reading this book all day. And she goes, well, what book are you reading? And you're like, oh, this is a Mark Twain novel. And she goes, well, that's not about alternators. That's not going to answer your question, right? You can't read texts and be looking for answers to questions that it's not interested in, that it's not addressing. That's an important interpretative thing. You don't find the answer to everything in every text. And a hermeneutical mistake that we often make is trying to force the issue on that, trying to force some kind of systematic theology question into it, or some kind of doctrinal question into every single text and try to hammer it out. I would tell you guys this is controversial, but I like to think that I have one controversial statement every class. And I guess for you guys from a distance, y'all aren't able to understand how tongue-in-cheek I am about this, but you guys here locally can. I mean this one seriously, though. If you don't have at least one text in all of Scripture that challenges your theological conclusions and your doctrine, I don't know what you're doing when you're reading Scripture. You mean to tell me you don't have one single text that just gives you problems? It just doesn't seem to fit, or the answer doesn't seem to fit with everything else that you've developed? Man, we all should have that, I think. I think we all do have it. I know there's a lot of you guys that are not all millennial, and so I know you have texts that don't fit into your your theological persuasion. So when we're reading these texts, don't lose sight of every text is not answering every question, right? Every text is not giving us every data point that we need. So consequently, this is some of those questions, by the way, might be, why do we exist? What's the purpose of existence or life? How do we relate to the cosmos? This quote, to go back to Walton, says, consequently, or in light of a similar idea that he's talking about in this chapter, consequently, religious and scientific cosmogonies are not necessarily opposed to one another. They might be complementary, working at different levels of reality to answer different questions. In particular, the old religious cosmogonies are not to be written off as outmoded scientific explanations, nor are they to be expected to answer modern scientific questions. Now, let me just cut to the only point that I'm trying to make here, is that when we're dealing with myth and history and genre and how reliable is this information, one of the problems that we make and others make in the interpretation of the Genesis narrative is if we run into something scientific that seems to conflict with this, then we're predisposed to think, well, we can just jettison the narrative. I'll give you a perfect example. God creates light and separates the light from the darkness, but he doesn't create the heavenly bodies prior to that. So the sun and moon come after light and darkness. So where does light come from, right? That's the kind of question that the scientific inquiry of this goes, this is impossible. The only source of light, in our galaxy or our universe, as far as we know, are stars. The only place where Earth is going to receive light is from the closest star that we refer to as the sun. If the sun didn't exist, then we couldn't have light and darkness because we don't have some source to give us those distinctions. So now we're taking a much later scientific question. We're applying it to an earlier text that's arguing about creation and saying, look, God created light and separated light from darkness. God did this by means of creating a sun and a moon, and the sun was out at day and the darkness and the moon and heavenly bodies were out at night. A very, not to sound Wellhausen about this, but a very primitive explanation of the universe that we live in, one that could be apprehended by the people that were receiving it. And we create conflict where really we're just having explanations at different stages in our history and knowledge of the universe as it exists. Like, how predisposed would the ancient Israelite be to the idea of an atom, the idea of a heliocentric universe? Would they even know what that meant? There are certain things that you can't expect an ancient text to explain the way that we would explain it later on. Now, this can send you in lots of different directions. This can send you in the direction of looking for ways to synthesize this. That might lead somebody to being a sort of evolutionary creationist. It might lead them to a gap theory. Other, possible explanations are out there. Day-age theory might be a possible explanation. Some people will go to a literary explanation of it, arguing that maybe these are not in chronological order, but there's some thematic arrangement. Or you could just read it the way that I do and just accept Genesis 1:3 for what 1:3 says, and 1:4 for what 1:4 says, and 1:5 for what 1:5 says. And if there's an issue that's pressing enough that it needs to be explained in detail, the author is going to make that known by pushing that issue to the front, right? And I'm going to just follow the author. And if it was really important to him, it's going to be really important to me. And if it wasn't important to him, then as interested as I might be about it, I don't care. A very simple way to put this is my daughter, one of my daughters, bought her a telescope for her birthday. We go out, we look at the sun. Made a critical parent mistake, and that's thinking you're young, or not the sun, sorry, the moon. That we got and look at the moon. Although I risked my life to look at the total eclipse with binoculars so I could see the little diamond thing. And I did see it, and I still have, vision that requires me to wear -8 contacts, but I can still see things. My daughter and I, we go out, we look at the moon, we look at stars, stuff like that through a telescope. Let me save all of you a parent mistake. When you go to buy your daughter a telescope, you think she's not going to be satisfied with like the $30 one, so you spend a few $100s on a good telescope. She would have been just as satisfied, it turns out, with the $30 one. But we go out and we look at all that, we're talking about it, and I can read Genesis, and I understand that Genesis doesn't give me the scientific basis on which to rationalize exactly all of this, unless I'm going to have to explain something about looking through the firmament, and you're going to run into problems. I can read Genesis just fine. I can look through the telescope just fine. And I don't feel like either one of these things are in conflict, because I can look at that and go, God created that. God created it, and it reliably, consistently revolves around the sun, just like we do, or the moon's revolving around the earth's revolving around the sun. And God's created his creation in an orderly, predictable, consistent, ongoing way. And what's more is we're told that by the power of the Lord Jesus, all of this is being sustained. That all of creation finds not only its beginning, but its consistency in him. So I can tell her, an amazing thing I learned about telescopes. Some of y'all know telescopes, and this is going to sound boring to you. But I got one of those, I forget what the technical term is, but you just turn a little knob as you're watching, and it follows the trajectory of the moon across the sky, because it's not stationary. It's moving both downward and across at the same time. So you can follow it. The universe is so predictable that some guy sitting in Taiwan can build a little gear for your telescope so that he can turn it at the same pace that the moon's moving across the sky. And then I can look at my daughter and say, that's because Jesus upholds all of the universe by his power. In him we live and move and have our being. Not just us as humans, but all of creation does. It's incredible. There doesn't have to be conflict. But if you go to find it, you'll probably find what you're looking for. I'm going to skip down over this next paragraph to where it says evangelical interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2 is myth. It would be fun to kind of throw this question out here and just set the class in motion. Is it legitimate? Is it possible for somebody who's truly evangelical to interpret Genesis 1-2 basically as a myth? By the way, not a myth in the sense that it didn't happen, or a myth in that it's a made-up story, but as maybe a non-historical, precise, chronological explanation of history. It's no surprise that evangelicals have attempted this, and that there are those, and sometimes it's surprising where you find an evangelical that sort of leans in this direction. It's important, by the way, tell Dr. Moore that I've got a quote from Peter Enns here. I think that, yeah, all right, just from y'all's laugh, I know I don't have to explain. It's important to understand that not all historians of the ancient Near East use the word myth as a shorthand for untrue. I agree with that. A mythology is a literary category. It's not just saying it's not true, the way that we say such and such is a myth. A more generous way of defining myth is an ancient, pre-modern, pre-scientific way of addressing questions of ultimate origins and meaning in the form of stories. Who are we? Where do we come from? This would be like saying an ancient Near Eastern myth is more akin to what we call a legend, right? Something that we're saying, okay, maybe it didn't happen precisely this way, but here's the gist of the story. Here's, the idea of what happened. Unlike the non-evangelical scholars, let me point something out real quick, though, in Peter Enns' quote here. This is just, maybe you can underline this, put a question mark by it, think on it later. He in his definition, he says a more generous way of defining myth is ancient. We all know what ancient is, okay? Extraordinarily old, early days of human history. We know what pre-modern is. Pre-modern is meaning pre really Enlightenment age, right? What does pre-scientific mean? Was there no science before the Renaissance? I kind of take exception with that piece of the definition. The idea that there was no science. Like, did ancient peoples not know anything about biology or anatomy or geology? Were there no natural sciences until the Renaissance? I kind of take exception with that, especially since this definition is getting into talking about the relationship of science and creation. No, there definitely was science before the Enlightenment period. It was just working with a more limited amount of information. By the way, I do wonder too if what we consider scientific today will not be obsolete in 200 years. What are going to be the big conclusions that we have now that 200 years from now we learn actually are not true at all? What if we learned this would change the world and could bring the world to an end? What if we learned the mitochondria is not actually the powerhouse of the cell, but that there's something else performing that function? Basically, I would say everything but gravity is subject to being yesterday's news, right, here at any given time. Unlike the non-evangelical scholars who reject the idea of divine revelation and inspiration, evangelical proponents of the myth view believe that careful attention to the A&E context of 1 and 2 occasions their interpretation. He goes on to say, do not discount that these chapters present facts, such as the fact that God is pre-existent, the fact that God is one and not many, human beings are created in God's image, etc. So here's an example of this. Tremper Longman, why would I quote from Tremper Longman? This is giving David Hacker heartburn again. He can't stand it. But part of the reason I would go to this is because if you, or if somebody in your church, or if a friend of yours that's going to seminary somewhere else, or a preacher in evangelical circles is going to come across the idea that Genesis 1 and 2 is a myth, they're not going to come across that in some obscure theological journal. They're not going to find it in some John Knox University Press volume. They're going to find it in something published by Baker or Zondervan. And guess what? Your people are getting hit with emails and newsletters and catalogs every day saying, buy this book about Tremper Longman, about Genesis, or this book about Peter Enns, about creation, or something like that. So I wanted to interact with sources you're liable to come across. Well, Tremper Longman is an example of a very accomplished scholar, a very solid academic. I can't think of any argument really that I've ever criticized of Tremper Longman's that I felt like was a result of just sloppy scholarship or this guy talking about stuff that he doesn't know about. I mean, this guy's a solid scholar. He's basically evangelical. Go ask him, do you believe in the Trinity? Do you believe in the resurrection of the dead? Do you believe in sola fide? He's going to believe all of those things. Do you believe in that God created the world from nothing? He's going to say, yes, I believe that. Do you believe in inspiration of the scriptures? Yes, I believe that. So he's basically evangelical, but he takes a mythological view of Genesis 1 and 2. He starts by drawing similarities between the Babylonian and Genesis creation accounts. All right. Somebody else critique Tremper Longman right from the gun here.
They're not that similar.
Okay. Number one, they're not that similar. Number two, what would Moses know about the Babylonian creation accounts? He didn't live in Babylon. He lived in Egypt. I know, okay, maybe my level of passion for this is maybe unwarranted. But it's a mistake, I think. Okay, Adam.
Even add that, so like the critical scholars, since they're putting the dating of the metric so late, it's like distance, but it's also time.
Okay.
It's like if we were writing books based off the Magna Carta or things like that, 800-900 years later, obsolete at that point.
Very good point. So it's even a problem for a critical scholar, not just in an evangelical interpretation, right? If they're placing the Pentateuch very late, now space and time and culture and language, all of these things might render this earlier account obsolete. That's a great point. So he draws some similarities. He says, Enuma Elish narrates how Marduk slaughtered the demon god Quingu and took his blood and mixed it with clay. Atrahasis, which we didn't talk about, but this is a probably earlier Akkadian epic, although it may have been composed later. Atrahasis describes the slaughter of the god Bela and Belit Eli, mixes his blood with clay. And the gods spit on the concoction, and humanity is brought into being, and the biblical account of creation, yada, yada, yada. You've already got the chart. We know that in these 44 lines of Tablet 6, that there's a slaying of the deity and some mixing of blood and mud and creation man from it. That's not enough to convince me these columns are analogous to one another, that these are totally built on one another. This is a good example of somebody, I'm not going to say it's disingenuous, but it's certainly inaccurate, representing, in a quote from their book, How to Read Genesis, which seems like the kind of book maybe a Sunday school teacher at your church might buy as they're going to be teaching through the book of Genesis. It presents it as if every story in Genesis is recreated this way in Enuma Elish. Oh, well, there's a direct analogy for how man was created from the dust. There's probably a direct analogy for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life and the serpent. And when in reality, there's none of those things. I would say if you take any two documents of this size, you can find some point of contact in between them. So it's just disingenuous. It's a misrepresentation of how much overlap there actually is. But in all likelihood, your people are only going to read this quote to the effect that there's this outrageous amount of similarity between the narratives. And by the way, even in his quote there, how much similarity is there really? Just the mention of mud and man coming out of it. He calls into question the function of the narrative within the larger canon. He asks, did the creation of Adam literally take place the way it is narrated? Or is the story of Adam's creation shaped to teach us about the nature of humanity? Did God really use the dust of the ground to form Adam's body and then blow his breath into it? If so, we should probably see the Mesopotamian account as a perversion of a fundamental truth preserved accurately in the biblical tradition. Longman is really onto something here. Now, for me, it's not an open-ended question. Was Adam a person? I can't believe what Paul said about Adam if I don't believe that he's a literal person. Now, I know that this is open to some debate and interpretation and stuff, but that's just, for me, I can't. Travis West said it's not open to debate or interpretation. It is a closed story. Thank you for that.
Well, I mean, one of the other things that, like, you read his book, The Way of Wisdom, and Dr. All the rest of the stuff.
Okay. So,
And,
yeah.
you know, one of his points of, I mean, he's an egalitarian.
Yes.
And because of his views on Genesis 1 and 2,
Yeah.
that's why he can say, well, male headship wasn't really a thing until the fall.
Yeah.
And then it's because of how he views it.
So this has wide-ranging, things. But here's, I do want to jump to something. I may mention it in a later lecture, but I do want to make sure that I make a point of this. You should underline and probably highlight and write a little bullet point beside this last sentence. If so, then we should probably see the Mesopotamian account as a perversion of a fundamental truth preserved accurately in the biblical tradition. Very simple, because I don't have enough time to do this in any detail. Ask your history of religions professor, how did all of these very similar accounts pop up? Well, it's obvious. The ancient peoples were all obsessed about creation, so they wrote a creation history, and then this Atrahasis was produced, and then Enuma Elish borrowed from it later, and then the Egyptians borrowed from that, and then the Hebrews borrowed from that, and we just have this one that we stands out in particular because we all have a Bible, but it's really just one of dozens. It's just a later fabrication. Same thing about the flood, same thing about the fall, same thing about the human condition. But I want to take you back to that theoretical situation I painted earlier, where every man and woman on earth is standing in the garden and knows God and receives revelation from him. Or that moment when the floodwaters recede, and once again, every human being whose feet touches dry ground knows the living God and knows the story of their origins, knows where they've come from. So we shouldn't suppose that what Moses is writing is something that's never been heard of before. He's codifying the official record of it. But these stories far predate Moses. And as they get off the boat, we learn that the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth are not all that rosy. They begin to scatter different places on the earth. And they have the story of creation. And they have the story of a great flood. They have the story of the fall. But what does man do with truth when it's left in his hands without the help of the Holy Spirit? He begins to pervert it, suppress it. And what we have in Enuma Elish, what we have in Atrahasis, what we have in the Epic of Gilgamesh is the perverted, later, bastardized version of the biblical account that had been passed down all the way up until the time of Moses. That explanation of how these two things can coexist would never fly in the mind of a history of religions professor. But I think it adequately accounts for, and I think that Longman hits onto this right here, that he catches that idea that there are points of contact, but it's not a backwards dependence looking to those things for information. It's the fact that the record has been preserved truthfully by Moses under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit and in a perverted fashion by every other culture in the world who had some form of this story and then began to pervert it and create it in their own image. He provides an alternative explanation predicated upon his method. He says, more likely, however, is the idea that Genesis has taken the Near Eastern tradition and then substituted God's breath for divine spit or blood. He was so close. I felt like he was so close to getting this right. And this is like watching your 4-year-old just throw your crankbait into a tree. And you knew they were going to just throw it out and catch a fish. And then a 90-degree turn, everything's disaster again. He could have said right here that the Mesopotamian account perverted the true, definitive, authoritative record in Scripture. And instead, he said, it really does seem like Genesis probably borrowed. It's unbelievable. Then he summarizes the point for the author. This communicates the truth that humans are creatures connected to the earth and beings who have a special relationship with God, for it was God who created humanity. So it gives you this real watered down, God knows humans and humans know God, and the ancient Israelites weren't capable of thinking beyond that to a more sophisticated, full-orbed plan of God in the world. It's really sad. Let's hit this next section and we'll try to do it in just a couple minutes and then we'll be done. As opposed to the mythological look of Genesis 1 and 2 as myth, which some evangelicals do, it could be interpreted as history. The literary genre of Genesis 1-2 is historical narrative, not poetic. We're going to consult again with our Hebrew delegate here. Is this true, Mr. Wattrich?
Yes, definitely prose, historical narrative.
Okay, so this is definitely prose narrative, says our Hebrew authority. And time does not permit him to talk about wow consecutive sequences and offset lines with that katal verbs and things like that. But there's just no question that Genesis 1 and 2 is narrative. And I'm gonna say this at the risk of hurting feelings tonight. It's not even really elevated prose. It's not mystical. It's not poetic history. I know that sounds so nice in commentaries and podcasts and stuff like that. People talk about the beautiful creation poem and elevated, and it's just really not. It's just not. It's just a record. I'm not saying that Scripture is not beautiful, but I'm saying that structurally it's no different than other narratives that are found all throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. Interpreting it as history means that the relationship of Genesis 1 and 2 to the creation myths has to be established, though. We have to be able to account for it. And I've already done this in large part by kind of playing my cards there and telling you what I think the direction of dependence is. Kenneth Kitchen, who's one of my favorite historians, and he truly is a historian, but he was an Egyptologist who was basically converted to Christianity as a result of his study. The common assumption that the Hebrew account is simply a purged and simplified version of the Babylonian legend applied to the flood stories is fallacious on methodological grounds. I love that word method, because it's not just saying what are our conclusions, but how do we get there? And this is a first-rate secular Egyptologist that's arguing for this. And he says the idea that it's simply purged and simplified version of the Babylonian is flawed methodologically. It's not just a bad conclusion, but the road to get there is bad. In the ancient Near East, the rule is that the simple account or traditions may give rise by accretion or embellishment to elaborate legends, but not vice versa. So in the ancient Near East, you don't see a paring down of stories to make it more simple. You see a building upon them. How could you be a critical scholar and on the one hand say that the Genesis narrative and the Hebrews take the creation and flood narratives of the A&E and they just chip away at them and simplify. And at the same time, when they create the biblical books themselves, they add and expand and elaborate and clarify. It's just methodologically inconsistent. Bill Arnold and Brian Bayer say there's no evidence that the Old Testament borrowed any of these parallels. And I would argue that's true. You can't take Enuma Elish or Atrahasis or any of the Egyptian mythologies and prove borrowing or dependence from one to the next. Instead, the Old Testament answered the same questions other authors of the ancient world were considering. But they did it in unique ways that expressed Israel's distinctive theology. So same questions, but vastly different answers. Why are we here? It's not just to feed the gods. Where did we come from? We come from deity, but not a pantheon of them, a single one. What is the relationship of the gods to the world? They weren't produced by it and come out of it and subdue it. God, singular, pre-existed and brought everything into being that is. Instead of borrowing or historicizing an ancient myth, it's fair to say that Genesis comes closer to a repudiation of pagan ideas about origin. Does that sound familiar to anyone from anything you've been reading? Not really. You'll get there. That quote from Matthews, by the way, continues on. He says, this undermines the philosophical basis for pagan myth. What does the New Testament say about Genesis 1 and 2? We're going to close with this. This is like that speed reading thing that you did in Sunday school. All right, everybody get your Bibles ready so you can find Romans 5 first. And by the way, this gives me literal nightmares in light of what I was telling you earlier about the recurring dreams. Let's just let the New Testament speak for itself. I know we don't have time for all of these. In Romans 5, beginning in verse 12, what does it say about the stories of Genesis 1 through 11? Sin came into the world through one man, death through sin. Death spread to all men because all have sinned. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there's no law. So death reigned from Adam to Moses. Wait, is Moses also just a typological figure here, just a kind of a representative for Israelite law? Why would he jut a literal Moses against a figurative Adam? It doesn't make sense. We could go on and on in that passage. Similar things talked about in 1 Corinthians 15. In 1 Timothy 2, verses 13 and 15, it says Adam was formed first and then Eve. I wonder where he got that from. Probably from Genesis. This is the basis for the things that Travis is talking about. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived. See, when the New Testament looks back on Genesis 1 to 11, it takes for granted the authority of these stories because of the historicity of them. All right, I have to conclude. We'll talk about flood narratives next week. You online guys, Dan, you've got your hand up. Do you have something I can answer in 30 seconds?
Yeah, very sentence there. So is the conclusion there that souls can't be evangelical and the story in Genesis is myth?
My conclusion would be yes.
Is there any pattern of neo-orthodoxy interpreting Genesis as myth?
Not unless your definition of evangelical gets very, very, very slim. We talked, early on about a lot of allegorical interpretation that existed in the early church. that certainly treating these narratives as mythological. We're in that strain. Many evangelicals do. Go read some of the ideas of Gleason Archer, Tremper Longman. It really depends on what you translate or how you define evangelical. But if we're saying this is somebody who believes in the Trinity, salvation through faith alone, the inspiration of Scripture, I can think of many evangelicals who treat it as myth. I don't recommend it, but there are those who do it.
Yeah, I would consider the neo-Orthodox folks to be evangelical. I was just wondering if that was how they would usually interpret it.
It's very broad. There are surprising names that interpret it as history and surprising names that interpret it as allegory.
It does sound like it varies overall.
It does. And so I'm not advocating for a mythological position, but such a thing does exist. So what I want us to see is our churches, our preaching are not really being threatened by scholars at Oxford University. They're being threatened by evangelicals who are telling us that Genesis 1 and 2 isn't history. And so that's why we're interacting with it.
All right, thank you.
Yes, sir. Good question, Dan. Anything else from you guys on Zoom? I'm going to have to log off so the other class can log on, which includes some of y'all. Hey, I really appreciate y'all. Welcome back. It's good to be back after a week.